really excited about this idea of talking about some of the issues that are affecting us in higher education these days. So this evening what I'm going to do is start off by making a few remarks, setting the context, and then I'm going to throw out some questions to individuals here and hope that we have a little sparky conversation amongst us all. So to begin, it's a challenging time to be in higher education. And for the last 2 days that I've been here talking with you, this has just been reinforced as I talk to people from Wisconsin, and I talk to people from Georgia, and I talk to fellow Texans about what's happening there with concealed campus carry laws and things like that. It's a time of shrinking state budgets and rising tuition. And this was raising concerns about the affordability and even actually the importance of college in many of our institutions or in states. Support for scholarly organizations has been threatened in budget battles, so diminished resources for museums, for libraries, for other kinds of scientific institutions. Universities are placing increasing importance on grantsmanship for tenure and promotion. And this is a relatively new development in higher education. A cornerstone of higher education, and in fact of education overall, tenure, is under attack. Fundamental notions of shared governance and academic freedom are under reconsideration, with numerous examples of faculty being censored for public statements. Be careful what you tweet. And we face attacks on science and fundamental scientific research by conservatives in our federal government. The nature of graduate education, competition with other environmental majors, and increasingly the extent to which we are being measured by external analytic organizations. That all of these things are highlights or lowlights of what is happening in higher education these days. And so this is the context in which I wanted to have this conversation about ways that we as geographers, geography departments, geography programs, can thrive in a time of real disruption in higher education. So the essential question is going to be, despite these challenges, what are the strengths and opportunities for geography to thrive? And so to answer that question, I've invited these 5 leaders to offer their visions and ideas and to make an outward glance at geography in higher education. And as I said, to begin a conversation about how our discipline can be successful in this atmosphere. So to my right, Chris Olds is a professor of geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, former department head there, and senior fellow for educational innovation in the provost's office. Kavita Pandit is a former president of AAG and currently associate provost for faculty affairs at Georgia State University. Yonette is the senior research advisor to the AAG and an associate professor at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine, where she teaches social epidemiology. Libby Wentz former council member, Dean of Social Sciences at the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Arizona State University, and Jenny Zorn is Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at California State University, Bakersfield. So a very distinguished group of people to carry on this discussion. So question 1. To begin, before we move to opportunities and strengths, may I ask each of you to share what you think are the biggest challenges geographers face in higher education these days? What are the kinds of factors disrupting higher education? And what are the current conditions for geographers from your perspective? And feel free to frame these questions in any way that you wish. So, Chris, I think you have some thoughts on that?
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you for the invitation to be here. I feel a little bit like I'm a zoo animal. I can walk around saying, I'm from Wisconsin, and they all go, wow, what's going on? So what I'm going to do is just say a few comments to get us going, reflecting on what I've been experiencing as a department chair in the provost's office, but also as a researcher on the globalization of higher education, in particular how our industry itself is in fact being constructed into a global services industry. And this is part of the the structural context I think we need to make sense of. So what I was going to do is just flag, I think what I see are four sort of core things driving a lot of change that our departments have to adapt to, adjust to, and that we should be taking a role in trying to understand and shape. First, on a financial systems level, right? This shift in many, many universities from what sometimes is deemed legacy-based budgeting to performance-based budgeting or activity-based budgeting, which has significant structural pressures, puts significant structural pressures on geography departments, especially in the United States, where the discipline of geography doesn't really go very far back with respect to K-12 education. And so many, many departments actually being now analyzed, assessed about activity, and what is activity? Is it, for example, majors, right? Departments everywhere, in most places at least, seeing declines in majors, and many departments play in, should we play the majors game or the credit hours game? So big structural shifts, situated though in the context of the shift towards STEM. The disciplinary structures shift, and the really significant challenges that geography, I think, departments face with respect to navigating interdisciplinary agendas that we help create, right? You can't have strong interdisciplinary agendas and programs, et cetera, centers unless you have strong disciplines, and yet navigating that creates huge tensions for departments, especially in contexts where there's strong international and environmental studies agendas and programs. The governance shifts that Sarah spoke about, pressures on shared governance, but I would add, with respect to governance, thinking about technologies of governance, right? How we are governed with respect to, for example, benchmarking, rankings, the new mechanisms to assess productivity. Academic analytics, for example, assesses our department, our provost looks at our department, but from a geographer's perspective, it's deeply problematic. They only go back 3 years with respect to counting impact of publications, and they don't count, for example, non-NIH, NSF grants as anything significant. It's foundation money. One of our faculty members brings in several $1 million. Zip, it counts for nothing unless we assert and reinforce that. And then finally, the narrative issue. I think, and this is certainly the case in Wisconsin, we have lost, as academics, I would say, control of the narrative with respect to thinking about education, how education is changing. Concepts like disruption themselves, in fact, are, right, metaphors or analogies that are created and pulled out of business schools. Clayton Christensen, his disruptive innovation agenda. So we've lost control of the narrative. And so I think that is something that's sort of floating out there, but it's a very significant thing we need to think about.
Now I'm depressed.
Sorry, I came from Wisconsin.
Kavita, what's your take on that?
Well, Chris has given such an fabulous framing. As I was thinking when you kind of gave us, indicated that you wanted us to start off with this, one thing that immediately popped in my mind about the challenges ties to the topic of interdisciplinarity. Geography as a discipline, we've always prided ourselves, perhaps, to lay people have said, we are the integrative discipline. We are the discipline that bridges and borrows and shares and integrates ideas and synthesizes different disciplines. So in a world where there's, in universities now, where there is a growth of interdisciplinary centers or multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, use a term that makes sense to you, we as geographers, I feel how do we are of course part of these, but no longer do we have that ground, or we may not have that ground, that we are the synthetic discipline. So I think this is, it's a tremendous opportunity because we have a long history of working in these settings. It comes naturally. We pick up languages from other disciplines. We're trained at that. At the same time, in framing who we are, what we do, when we are just another discipline coming into that interdisciplinary centers, I think there's some reflection of how do we position ourselves in that setting.
really something important. Yonette, from your perspective, a little inside, a little outside of geography.
So I guess I should fess up right now and say that I'm not a geographer. But I play with geographers a lot. And that's important because as the chief of epidemiology at the National Institute of Drug Abuse at the NIH, I recognized early the importance of engaging geographers to help us think spatially about the problems we were dealing with. And I think that fits right into your interdisciplinarity issue. And one of the things I want to embolden geographers is something I always say. We're moving towards the science teams of the future, and geographers have a place because geographers are especially equipped to articulate the spatial context in which health behavior and people operate. I'm talking about health behavior in this instance. And the important thing I always talk to my students about, and I talk to my colleagues at the NIH, is when I talk about working with geographers, they say, well, are they going to do the maps? And I always point out that geographers are not we just don't use their tools. They should be part of the left hand of the equation. And by that I mean part of articulating the question. So I put a challenge out to you geographers to ensure, as we work in this interdisciplinary world, it's important. You have to be part of the question because the answer comes out poorly and it's not truly spatial because people out there, I actually was on a panel at the British Embassy in DC and it was about mental health in cities. And I was shocked to meet a young woman who says she's a GIS expert. Well, of course, tell you what I know. And I immediately said to her, oh, great, you're a member of the AAG. And she said, what is that? So I need not say any more. So that's one of my pet peeves. I think geographers need to be part of the left-hand side of the equation. The second thing is why that's important. You talked about the need for funding, and you mentioned NIH, because if you don't have NIH funding, you don't have the great R01. You're not considered to be a true scientist, quote unquote. But that's ironic because this is the very time when NIH is shrinking. It's focused on precision medicine and the global social science perspective, social and behavioral science perspective has disappeared considerably. Why is that important? Because when you submit a grant application to the NIH, you probably will get unscored. And again, as geographers, we need to articulate that there need to be geographers on review committees. Because I was on the population science committee for the longest while after I left the NIH, and I would fight a geographer would come in with a really cool, well-articulated proposal, but nobody on the team was a geographer, and nobody really understood what they were doing. So it would get unscored or get a poor score. And I would try to fight and articulate this is why we should be doing this, but we need more voices. So it's a very important thing, especially when funding is an issue, that those two considerations, and I'll stop there.
I'm hearing lots of really concrete strategies and things we need to do to thrive. Well, as a GIS expert, I mean, how do you feel about this? And real GIS.
Yeah, I think I've known about the AAG since I started with GIS, so I think I'm pretty good there. But I kind of want to turn to it, so with GIS, of course, it's a very technology-driven field, and of course, a lot of the conversations, back to what Chris was saying about, is it majors, is it student credit hours, is it number of people in classes, has raised an interesting point because a lot of the attention for the educational aspects of teaching have gone towards online education, and that's been a very disruptive force in higher education. In fact, in a lot of the disciplines at Arizona State, we're starting to see the number of campus students going down and the number of digital immersion students. They're not called online students, they're called digital immersion students. The difference is, and I actually kind of am buying in, maybe I'm not just drinking the Kool-Aid, but I'm making the Kool-Aid too. But the idea is that a campus immersion student is digitally enabled, because a lot of them will take online classes, they'll do Blackboard, so they call them campus immersion, digitally enabled, and then the ones that are strictly online are called digital immersion students. So that's the clarity of language there. But of course, what does that mean for geography, and which is a very sensory kind of discipline? And how do you translate some of the parts of geography into a digital environment so that it's meaningful? Is it just a matter of looking at the adiabatic lapse rate and moving around on the computer screen, or is it somehow going outside and looking at the clouds and trying to understand how we classify those clouds, talking to people and all the experiences associated with becoming a geographer, so that we can address the kinds of questions that we all aim to do. And I think the trend is clear. I think that the digitally enabled lessons and the digitally enabled ways of teaching are significantly more than just putting your PowerPoint presentations online, and we need to be creative and come up with ways that we are going to engage a much broader range of people with this digitally enabled technology that still resonates and still gets the message across that we want to do. We're certainly seeing an inversion in terms of the majors in our online programs is increasing. So I think that's something that we need to make sure we're part of the conversation about, and make sure that we aren't just saying, no, we're going to just do it the old school way, because we'll be left behind, but we still want to make sure that the message of geography still holds within it.
Well, that resonates with me as a geography educator, the idea we have to be innovative about the pedagogy.
Absolutely.
And engage in these discussions.
And the second piece, the second point that I wanted to make here as well relates a little bit to the interdisciplinary piece that everybody brought up here. And so right now I'm the Dean of Social Sciences in a college that includes humanities and includes natural sciences. And I heard Doug's introductory remarks talking about how Glenn McDonald is going to be talking about the Anthropocene. And I think that's a really important conversation for us to be having, because of course, a lot of the physical scientists, which many of them are geographers by training, some of them are not, are starting to understand and see how people are interacting with the physical environment. And some of them are some of the ecologists and hydrologists this is like a brand new concept to them. Of course, to us, it's like, well, of course. And so, to a certain extent, there's some of them that are really reinventing the wheel. Then there's the other side of, my office, which is the humanities. And the digital humanities is starting to really appreciate and come to accept some of particularly the methods associated with the social sciences, and in part GIS is starting to resonate very strongly with them. And again, this is sort of these, we could put maps in computers and, okay, yes, we can do that. And it's really interesting insights that they're starting to see. And I think we need to step up and take credit for these things, because to them, these are new discoveries, and we need to be at the forefront of these conversations and be a part of that.
Good point, good point. And Jenny, from your perspective?
Yeah, I'll take a broader perspective. I'll take us back a couple years to Aristotle, who said intelligence is supreme among goods. And I think, to echo what others have said, is we are at a place where education is not seen as a public good anymore. It's seen as a human capital investment, where I pay for my child's education as an investment in his or her human capital. But I think there's a public good there too. And I want my neighbor's child to be educated, because they're going to be my doctor or nurse years from now. I want them to be my mayor. I want them to serve society. And I think we're moving away from that idea that it is a public good. And so I'd like to change that narrative you often hear the statistic that if you get a college degree, you will make more than $1 million than a person with a high school degree over the course of your lifetime. Well, I think we have to reframe that and not talk about the personal investment of that individual, but talk about what is the benefit to society. by educating more people and having them highly educated. You know, when you hear people in presidential debates and on presidential stages at their events say that they love uneducated people, you really see the devaluing of education. And I think we have a real role to play there, that we do have to show the value of education, and I think geographers need to be on that pulpit as well, and making the argument that educated people will make us a safer society. You look at fascist regimes historically, and uneducated people are easier to control than educated people.
Absolutely. I would like to add something to what you're saying, and I think that there is part of that narrative in the current dialogue is, you know, what do you talk to people's kids and they say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And it ends with a noun. I want to be a doctor, a lawyer, a fireman, or a nurse, and an educated person is not part of that narrative. And so part of the narrative that I've been having with my kids is not so much what do you want to be, but what kind of life do you want to have, and how do you want to spend your time? And you know, I know that the AAG has been working a lot in terms of bringing geography back into K-12 education, but I think that there is still a significant number of us where geography is a found major. It's not something they start in as freshmen, they find it as sophomores or juniors. And because you don't come out of high school saying, I want to be a geographer, but you come out at the end of your degree understanding sort of what that kind of geography degree can give you in terms of a career path. Even if your title is geographer, which those titles do exist, most people who do earn degrees in geography don't earn that title in their job description. So I think that's an important thing, that we play a significant role in the narrative and contribute significantly to how we think about higher education. So I appreciate that comment.
Absolutely. And we hope that the Advanced Placement Human Geography course does bring us more people who want to come as freshmen as geography majors, but that it's happening in smaller numbers. But let me come back to you, Libby, again, and ask you about one of the things that we did in preparation for this was to begin to kind of have an email conversation about some of these issues. And one of the things that came up for us to talk about was the idea of rebranding geography. Many departments have been renaming themselves, and is that a fundamental change in mission, or is it just simply a rebranding, a repackaging? What do you think about that in terms of a strategy?
So first of all, I think we probably would all agree here that geography is more important now than ever. And I think the conversation that we were having before, I think that holds true. And so what does it mean to rebrand or to rename ourselves? And in my opinion, the rebranding part has the implication of somehow changing our focus or changing our direction. And I question whether or not that makes sense, because I think that, you know, all of us here in the room would argue that our disciplinary roots are really vital to us. As the programs shift, however, we want to make sure we bring those into this discussion. So then the other concept is renaming, and what does renaming do? And renaming, of course, implies sort of an implication of rebranding as well, that somehow you represent something different or something broader or more focused. So a couple of examples at Arizona State University that I can be more specific on. We created from scratch a School of Sustainability, which I know it was one of the world's first schools of sustainability, and we're really fortunate that the dean of that school is actually a geographer by training, Kristopher. And so he brings to the table a lot of the perspectives that we have here in geography. But of course it raises questions about, well, how is geography, which has sort of the human dimensions of global change, and the School of Sustainability different? Why would a student choose one versus the other? And in fact, what happens at ASU is a lot of students double major. They find courses and parts of the major in sustainability good, and then also find some of the training in GIS and remote sensing and geography also important for their major. So one of the challenges, of course, is how do we distinguish geography from sustainability in this particular case? The other activity that happened at Arizona State is we also underwent a renaming. So we went from the Department of Geography to the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning. And it was a merger of two different disciplines, Department of Geography and School of Planning. And so the challenges, of course, with that are that you've got now different disciplinary norms that are being brought together under a single administrative umbrella that are now expected to operate as a whole. And we're supposed to operate as a whole and understand what it is that we bring to the table as a unified group, and yet still retain sort of our own disciplinary identities as well, because we still have a geography undergraduate degree, a geography PhD, a planning undergraduate degree, a planning graduate degrees. And so one of the conversations that we had, and I think this was important for the rebranding to sort of retain our identity, is what do the two disciplines have in common? And what I brought to the table was the idea of location or place or space. Both geographers and planners think about both of those. Now, I'm going out on a limb here. Geographers tend to think more about the past up until the present, maybe make some mention of the future, and certainly people who work in like climate change and climate science probably do quite a bit about looking into the future. Planners, at the same time, look mostly at the present, but really talk very specifically about what the future is going to look like. And so we come together in a place that the way that we conceptualize time is actually what's different, and we bring that to the table in a very different way than some of the other interdisciplinary units that are bringing. So I think that it needs to be, in terms of renaming or rebranding, I think it needs to be a conscious effort and something that you do that still holds on to your disciplinary roots, but brings something more meaningful to the table.
And I would say you don't want to do it just for the name change sake. That you think that that's going to bring in 10 more students every year or something like that. I think you have to think in terms of these things, as well as everything that you're working on in your departments, in terms of what are the outside pressures that a president is dealing with. So it's accountability, return on investment that the taxpayers want. What are the pressures on the provost? What are the pressures on the deans? What are their initiatives? And if you can find a way to couple what you're trying to achieve with what the administration is trying to achieve, then you're going to be in a win situation. So I can remember a dean of a library coming into my office and saying, how can I help you? What's your latest problem? How can I help you with it? And I thought, how can my latest problem? Okay, my latest problem right now is I've got a bunch of Saudi students coming, and the Saudi Arabian Cultural Mission is saying, I'm not going to send you anymore because you don't have a prayer room for them. There's no mosque in town, and they need that. And I said, that's my latest problem. So how's the dean of the library going to help? Well, he walked out of the office, and before I knew it, I had a phone call that said, I've got a meditation room identified in the library, and he solved that problem for me. So he was golden. He got a lot for the holidays. So thinking in those terms, and that is exactly how he thought. How can the library be the center of everything that's going on at the university? And so if you can position yourself and think of yourself of how geography can contribute to whatever the agendas are at the university, that can help you.
Embrace change. So,
Yeah.
Chris, you mentioned the fact that geography departments are losing enrollment. What's your take on this idea of rebranding, renaming, and that fight to keep majors?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a couple things. Obviously, it will really depend on where you're coming from. I'm in a department that has a longer history. Some rooms we're changing them, though, you're surrounded by all these old white guys on the wall in the black and white photos. And so the notion of actually trying to rebrand and change naming, you sort of feel this weight of history. But I'd almost sort of rather position it and sort of think about, well, how do we adjust to and think about these emerging sort of contested areas where we have a natural capability of providing inputs, insights, taking responsibility for, and think about those. So for example, If you just think about GIS, it's in some ways we've lost that game, right? There's GIS in planning, there's GIS in forestry and wildlife ecology, there's GIS in engineering. Everybody is doing. We don't have an architecture program, but one of the interesting areas that we've been pulled into, and we have a natural ability to contribute to, is cartography and visualization, right? And this is the visual era, in the era of so-called big data. Huge discussions and debates about thinking, how to represent data, how to visualize it. And we've got this long history of cartography, very active computer cartographers. And it's sort of an emerging area that there's interest across campus. And what we're trying to do is sort of think, what's our role in taking responsibility for that? And in some ways, some of these areas, there's contests. It's a serious struggle. In other ways, for example, in this one, we actually have a really natural capability there, but we haven't necessarily taken advantage of that. And again, just think, from computer science to engineering to business, everybody's trying to think how to visualize and how to represent what's going on in the world. And so it's sort of that way we might rebrand while keeping our name as is, at least for now.
That's a great point. So just to shift, we've been talking institutional level, department level. What about individual faculty? And I'm going to throw this question to you, Kavita. What do you see are the key drivers of change in the current models for faculty? And what will faculty work and contractual arrangements look like 5, 10, 15 years from now?
Thanks, Sarah. So I've often felt that the best way to predict faculty arrangements, faculty models, looking out, is to talk to graduate students today. And really not talk to, listen to graduate, I guess correction, listen to graduate students. And I'll give you just I arrived late last night, so just today in the half or 3/4 of the day, but I've been attending sessions or having informal conversations. I'll give you just 2 examples. This morning, sitting around in the lobby, just random conversations with someone sitting there, both graduate students, this is their first AAG for both of them. One of them was coming from industry, had worked for a lab not far from here, doing analytical work and kind of with mineralogy, if I can say that, get that word out, and was looking for a way to integrate that and, in a way that goes beyond physical geography. I'm sure each one of us has suggestions for her. The second person was a professional artist who was attracted to geography, was talking to me, how do I navigate this big old meeting to find my connections? And, what struck me is clearly many of our departments would give these students great homes, but once they go out, assuming they want to go out in the academy, how do we work? I find that our structures, whether it be promotion or tenure, recruitment, hiring, are much slower to move than what new faculty want to be doing. We're still struggling with interdisciplinarity. How do we arrange? I'm sure, Libby, you've had to kind of figure out what percentage of their time, how do we evaluate them, who's on the tenure evaluation committee, how are their lines divided? I have so many interdisciplinary faculty often ask me, I don't know how I'm going to be evaluated, who should mentor me? So we're still grappling with that. But looking ahead, what about appointments that are industry, academia, appointments across different institutions, appointments that are kind of arts, community, and academia, that are more than simply visiting adjuncts. These are the kind of models we are hurtling towards, and our systems are, still a generation behind, if I might say so. And there's a wonderful quote that I don't know who to attribute it to, but I'll kind of just suggest that. It says, when you have new faculty, either they change the university or the university changes them. And you can apply that to your departments, geography. When we hire new geographers, either they're going to change our department or we're going to shape them into what we want them to. And which one would be larger to have. And then the second instance, very quickly, we've been all hearing about the student activism that is coming, out of the state of Missouri, university, but it's spreading across the country. And here are students very passionate, in this case about diversity, inclusion, are screaming to be heard on certain issues. Yes, it's coming up, yes, it's coming up against faculty governance, who decides what's taught, who decides who's hired. Yet there is a very loud voice out there, and are we listening? Because this is what's going to determine where universities, departments, and our models of faculty recruitment, hiring will be, that's what will shape them, or that's what they'll need to be responsive to.
Well, kind of related to that, I'm going to throw this one to Jenny. What do you see as the future of tenure? Everybody should go,
Half the audience is not good.
I have always valued tenure. I think the purpose for tenure is to protect the research agendas, basically, is to protect our ability to push the boundaries. I can remember when I was in grade school or middle school, there was this grand debate and this argument that I remember participating in a debate about continental drift, whether it was real or not. And without things like tenure to allow people to push the envelope and do the research so that we can document climate change or whatever it is, I think tenure has to be there to protect that academic freedom, to protect the pushing of the boundaries. So I hope that it will continue to be there because I think there is a need for it. When we look at the number of tenure track faculty that have declined, or the percentage that have declined over the last 10 years, and the balance of part-time faculty and full-time lecturers and tenure track or tenured faculty, I think we're out of balance now. I think we need all of those people in our departments. You need part-timers. You need a CEO from the local bank to teach a finance course for you. Wouldn't you love to have Jack Dangermond come in and teach a course for you? So you want to have the ability to hire those people who will come in and just teach one course. You also want lecturers there that are full-time lecturers. They're dedicated to their teaching and to the university for many years in many cases. But I think the balance is off, and we need a higher percentage of tenure track faculty to do the shared governance, to carry on the culture of the department. And I will say, sort of in comment to what Kavita was talking about, I think deans, I've seen a lot of dean reports on RTP, provost reports on RTP, and I can tell you they're much more willing to be entrepreneurial and allow those newer, younger faculty members to do more creative things. I think it's the older faculty that are just used to, this is how I got tenure, and so you're going to do it that way. And they're not as open to that. And so we have to find a way to change the culture within our departments also, so that they can see that there are different ways of doing things and the way we did them, because that's what happened. That's how I got tenure.
So the way you change a culture in a department, though, is through leadership. So how do we as geographers create this opportunity for leadership to help lead departments?
I think we have to get out of our discipline to do that. I think we have to look at higher ed and participate in higher ed conferences. And so go to the ACE conference. I'm going to give you a lot of alphabet soup here. ASCU and AACU, and this is where those discussions are taking place. And deans and provosts are going to those. So they're hearing about the new way that you do this or that. but the faculty really aren't hearing those. There are very few faculty that will participate in those. And so if there's a way that we can get us out of the discipline so we can see what's happening in the context of higher ed, I think that could be helpful. I mean, that's how you get assessment in departments that, you know, oh, nobody wants to do assessment. But you start sending a few faculty members to some assessment conferences, they drink the Kool-Aid, they come back and they're making the Kool-Aid then. So, you know, you've got to have us look outside the discipline too.
All right, Chris is going to say something.
Yeah.
I have to say something about tenure. One thing I guess I would just like to reinforce the issue of tenure and the fact that tenure is being targeted right now. So there's a big playbook. This is a very US-centric discussion, I realize, having lived and worked in England and in Singapore, everybody handles these things differently. But the traditional conceptions of tenure, right, there's a target on it, our state, this is what is happening right now, and it's being used as a vehicle to try to unsettle tenure. And the playbook is basically this. Traditional conception, tenure track, you're tenured, you can be fired if you run away with the computers, steal money, those sorts of things, or if there's an institutional fiscal crisis. The agenda right now that's unfolding is that tenure will be loosened up such that programs and departments, if there are educational or fiscal logics for restructuring, they may be thinking about what to do with the faculty, but they will have the right to actually fire tenured professors for, again, educational and or fiscal reasons, not at an institutional scale, but at a programmatic scale, at a department scale. And so what has to happen actually is that in everybody's institutions, you have to get involved and play a role in trying to shape the unfolding of this process, because this happens in different places in different ways. And we're involved down to the nitty-gritty. What is the definition of a program, right? Is it a program related actually to one person, or is it a bundle of people and educational programs and so on? And I can basically say this is a national scale agenda, and it's being trialed where I'm located right now, and it's a complicated, exhausting process, but it's worth engaging with.
Can I add to that? And I wanted to sort of focus on the non-tenure track side of it, because we're talking about maybe two-thirds of the professorate in the non-tenure track. Maybe many here in this room are fall in that group. One of the, answering the question posed to me earlier, future models of faculty, I do see a trend, and interpret it, you can value it what you think, there are different ways people have looked at this, but I do see universities slowly shifting to recognizing that for the success of their students and the institutions, the non-tenure track faculty there needs to be more invested in them. Many are shifting from part-time, short of Jack Dangerman, who of course will be part-time, but to more full-time with benefits, with some role in faculty governance, so that there's a great investment by those faculty in the institution, and it makes for stronger, it's improvement in many cases. What has intrigued me is those developments, on the one hand, you would say these are very positive. I've seen many groups representing tenured faculty sometimes frustrated at that, because it's seen as a mechanism to undermine tenure by making the life of the non-tenure track faculty less awful, So I'm not quite sure how to go with that, but it did puzzle me when I saw some of these developments as, oh my gosh, this is a fresh attack on tenure because you're really investing in the non-tenure track.
I want to build on something you said earlier in terms of the graduate students, and I have found that a lot of the graduate students that I've worked with have been far more entrepreneurial in the way that they've been thinking about and fostering their future careers. In fact, many of them now don't even want tenure track positions. We train PhD students, and you know, it's still a metric used in many institutions in terms of looking at the success of your graduate programs in terms of their placement. And I think the graduate programs that I've worked with now are starting to really think about how that's shifting too, in terms of what is the success of a graduate program in terms of their employability, whether they go into NGOs or in the government sector, in terms of really using their skill sets. And there's a lot of them that also are seeing, you know, assistant professors who have split appointments and who are pulling their hair out in terms of trying to earn promotion and tenure because they have to do service in 2 different units and teach in 2 different units and have to have visibility in 2 different units. And some of the graduate students that I've worked with are just frankly turned off by that, and they see no need for having that kind of life. And so I think that there is a role for thinking creatively. And also with I think you said, you know, a lot of them go to full-time for the fixed term contract faculty. Not only are they getting full-time appointments, we're starting to see also a trend for having a career track with promotions and really valuing the contributions, not only in governance and full-time, but having, you know, real promotion opportunities as well, which I think is a real asset.
So we've talked at institutional level, we've talked now in terms of faculty level. I want to come back and think a little bit more about both faculty and students. And I'm going to throw this question to you, Yonette. What can we do to make our discipline more diverse?
So I want to, before I answer your question,
Yeah.
I want to pick up on what Libby said. I'm seeing a lot of geography PhDs and different ones coming into the government. I know I can speak from the NIH perspective. So it's quite interesting that there are people, and in mentoring my students in the epidemiology field, a lot of crossover with geography and epidemiology. And I think your point is well taken that there needs to be some facility, some recognition that it's part of the millennial generation perhaps. The people are looking for more creative and strategic ways in which they engage the workforce. And it's not necessarily going up the tenure line, but it's viable nonetheless because it's important. And I am a really strong proponent of keeping that identity. The geography identity is very important because you can't articulate a discipline if you don't have the identity. And so, at least I counsel my students, don't give up your geography. So I just wanted to add that. It's very important when you're going into multidisciplinary teams.
We're going to make you an honorary geographer.
So, to answer your question in terms of diversity, I often think of scientific diversity, and I spent a decade at the NIH focusing on science themes of the future, and geographers play a very important role in that. Whether we're talking about how climate change impacts health, or whether we're talking about disease transmission, or whatever we're talking about. I think in my work at the NIH, and Doug Richardson will tell you, we went with geography and drug addiction, now we're doing geography and urban health, but it's very important because as an epidemiologist, I need the help of that geographic spatial thinking, and geographers infiltrate the other sciences to get, I've seen physiologists think of how to map their zebrafish and why it's important to think of them spatially. Somebody like Mei-Po Kwan got us thinking at the NIH in 3 dimensions. It was like, you know, you had people, physicians all googly-eyed. Oh, I can see my patients differently, or my zebrafish differently. So I think we really have to embrace scientific diversity and geographers across the spectrum. Geography is not a homogeneous group. They play an important role in facilitating that diversity. The way we think about climate, the way we think about, Mei-Po has got me thinking that walking down the street, you think of it in 3 dimensions. But, you know, various ways. I think it's actually a very exciting time for science, for the diversity of science.
So let me throw it open to all of you. Are we preparing our undergraduate and graduate students to work in these kinds of teams?
I want to answer that question in relative to students, but with a little bit more of a maybe traditional or usual way of thinking about diversity in terms of ethnic, cultural, racial, gender diversity, and how we engage with our students on that level. And so I started to think about the classes that I teach and the homework assignments that I give, and how important it is. So, you know, of course, from an administrative perspective, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on targeted hiring opportunities, bringing somebody in who is underrepresented minority to then represent that particular group. And certainly that's an important strategy, because students can then find sort of commonality with that person. And I think that's an important strategy, but I think that it's not just the responsibility of that underrepresented minority to be the one who does all the work in that. I think that's a pretty significant burden. And so I was starting to think about what can I do? And I think it was a conversation at one of the National Council meetings where we were talking about sort of our classroom coursework. So ASU's mission is access to education and really bringing in a lot of first-generation college students. And a lot of the ones at Arizona State are either Native Americans or Latino origin. And so I was thinking about the homework assignments that I had and how very Caucasian, middle-class centric my simple GIS exercises were. And how I had to start thinking about strategically about how do I make those, even one classroom assignment or one example that I give in class, to make that relevant for first generation college students, so that they can say, okay, I can understand why I'm learning about scale and projection and coordinate systems in my class, and not just having them be something that's abstract. And so even a GIS class can bring in examples that are relevant to people who are outside your individual world. And that's something that I think all of us can strive to do, even if it's one example in a classroom where they can pick up and go, oh, I get that. And I think there's a lot of context for that we can build on.
Yeah. Can I just follow up on that? So I sit on a board for the National Hispanic Science Network, and oftentimes you think of first generation. I get this question all the time from people, so if I do geography, will I get a job? How will I, my family doesn't see that as a viable option for me. So it's intertwined with how you articulate and get the field, people to see the dynamism of being in geography and the range of opportunities one can engage in as a geographer. Because that's something that comes up really strong in first generation. People say, well, I'm geography. It's like, what are you going to do with that kind of thing? So it's important as you think of how do you prepare those students.
We also do have a lot of work to do. An anecdote that came to mind when you were speaking was, this must have been about 10 years ago when I was attending one of those conferences on, and I'm probably going to get it wrong, but was it the one that's held every 2 years? Is it race, place, and geography?
And ethnicity.
Yes, thank you. And it was at Howard University. It was, it was held at Howard University. Must have been about 10 years ago. And so it was on the campus, and of course, the geographers interested in these kinds of topics, much younger, itself much more diverse, was sort of streaming into the student center where the sessions were being held. And I remember we were working, and Doug will of course remember Orlando Taylor, who was a part of that. And so he came in a little late, and he says, my goodness, all the Howard students were seeing all the outsiders streaming into this student center. So they stopped and asked him, what's going on there? And he says, oh, it's a geography conference. There's geography. Those folks don't look like geographers. and I got me to think, what does the world think geographers look like? And the only conclusion I came to was, the pith helmets and the cocky, the old explorer image or something. But certainly their visual image of geographers was something other than what they were seeing there.
Right. And I should mention that AAG has a task force led by Mona Dimash on diversification of curriculum. So we're certainly looking at that as an entree to making us more diverse discipline. Okay.
A lot of,
Oh.
go ahead.
Could I just throw in one, sorry, where my department chair hat? One issue that we found that is worth thinking about is who is the responsibility, is it in a department to facilitate and enable some of these changes and shifts? And one of the broader discussions sometimes is people always think it's professors who have to be involved, who are guiding and shaping this, but in fact we found that often staff play a key role. You obviously have to have the right staff, like you have the right faculty, but faculty and staff working together and enabling and creating these sort of situations and practices and bringing together different groups of people, different types of students and faculty. And in our cartography lab, for example, does that. And they blend and blur skills, bringing in people from outside and inside the university, people from different sectors, and they help enable and support on a professional development level all sorts of changes with respect to our students that faculty, to be honest, often cannot do simply because they don't have that experience. Many of them have just gone straight through. And I think it's important to think about the role and recognition we give for staff on that front.
Great. And Jenny?
And I'll it's kind of along the lines of what I was going to say. A lot of the research about first-generation students says that they need a sense of belonging, that they walk into the university and they don't think they belong there to begin with. Their parents never went there. They don't think they belong. And so we have to help them see that they belong and help them succeed and belong. And so when you look at those sorts of things, if you have a department that is all white, then yes, then you try and find staff that might be supportive. You try and be the bridge faculty member who will, or the bridge white person that will help them feel comfortable in that environment and that they belong. And they need to continually have that assurance that they belong. David Yeager is a psychologist from UT Austin. In his research, he looked at first-generation students, and from the moment they came in, at the end of their first term, they started dropping out. And he looked at second term, and they continued dropping out. And he conducted many surveys, and what he is finding is they need that assurance. So you get to the end of the first term, they get a probation letter that says you're on probation. Well, think about what the word probation means to people outside of the university. It's associated with jail. So you want to be very careful how you identify and label them. And if they can see that there's hope, that this is very normal, that everybody else is feeling like they don't fit in, and if you can reassure them that it does get better and get them engaged in ways in the university, then they will stay and you will retain them. And it's far cheaper to retain a student than it is to recruit a new one to replace them.
That's right. Okay, so for our last kind of question, I want to kind of take us out of the United States context. Chris, I think it was you mentioning the globalization of higher education and the implications for geography. We're recruiting students from all around the world, undergraduates as well as graduate students, offshoring programs. What role does geography have in this kind of, I mean, you'd think it's innately geographic to be global, but how can we thrive in this kind of really internationally competitive context?
Sorry, maybe I'll just make a couple of comments in relationship to this. So first, one, and these will be sort of somewhat random comments. The first is the recognition that actually geography departments have some very actually traditional, sometimes what might be deemed to be quite stuffy courses, world regions courses, that actually are often mothballed, including one that I recently resurrected and turned into a 100% online course, but that tie in very much in the whole global competencies agenda with respect to thinking about education and the transformation of our students' identities and subjectivities and citizenship. So I think one thing that's worth thinking about is what is geography's role with respect to, again, traditional sort of teaching, but how do we play a role in trying to refashion it and make it a very positive experience for students. And the digital agenda and platform enable you to actually do things. I teach a World Regions course, 100% online, but I am an orchestrator. There is no way it's actually ethical for me to speak about South America. I've never been to South America, but I have expertise that I bring in and I orchestrate, and they are the voices in this course, and they teach the students in there. I teach some regions, but not others. So I think it's worth sort of thinking about that. The one other point that I would make, most universities have internationalization strategies. They have mechanisms that they think about, all sorts of mechanisms, from mobility to dual judge degrees to curricular transformations and establishing branch campuses and so on. But the one thing that most departments don't do, nor most universities, is actually think about the logics. Why are we actually doing this? And is this the right thing to do, right? Sometimes these logics in the end are core cooperative agendas. Sometimes they're competitive agendas. Sometimes they're corporatization agendas. It's an attempt to generate revenue to support programs and departments. But the whole issue of the mission, right, the logic, is often very rarely actually thought about and unpacked. And so what I would recommend is that we, as departments, actually have a role to play in thinking and fleshing out what the why question. Why are we doing this? What are these logics? And is this the best way to move forward?
Anybody else have Kavita? You work in this.
No, I think Chris is a master here, but this is a very sort of not a very philosophical approach. I do agree with unpacking the agenda because there's so many agendas that come into internationalization. You know, we often bemoan that within the US, geography as a discipline is, despite our best effort, not as widely known as we would like, or at least not on par with other disciplines. Yet when you look at other countries, geography departments or colleges or schools faculties are very often highly respected, maybe leading faculties in those countries. So as we develop those partnering arrangements, it may well be that the prominence of our department or in your particular university may actually be heightened by what it brings back in reflection by partnering with a university that really sees that partnership as very significant. I don't know if I articulated that clearly, but yeah.
I think this is non-philosophical, but in connecting. So I was born and raised in South America, and went through a British system of education, and geography was always a prominent class, the course that we took all through grammar school, all through high school. And in my third life, I'll come back as a geographer, but because I was fascinated with what I learned in geography. So one of the, I often, this is a question I've had for you guys, is as you engage more international students who are coming from training in geography, some of them might have done a first degree in geography before coming here, and I've encountered many people who changed because they went to a school where there wasn't a geography department and they couldn't follow on, so they ended up in planning or something else. How do you see that engaging students in this global village that we live in, students coming from international institutions wanting to do geography in the US? How do we engage them? What's your thinking? I mean, is this?
My short answer to that would be, if you look at the major source countries for international students, it's China, India, and South Korea, right, the top three. And very often students from those countries come with a very definite niche within geography. I mean, one of my former Chinese students who's now doing very well, but she had such a struggle even as a grad student because she did not want to do GIS. She wanted to do urban ethnic geography, and I had to swim against the tide with fellow Chinese students, with our Chinese faculty, with the assumption that she was being niched there. So I guess it's, there isn't that, the students self-select themselves sometimes in what they're studying. And I'm not quite sure how much of the breadth of international students are coming to geography, or whether it's some subgroups, you know.
I would just add to that, it's not exactly answering what you're saying, but I think it's part of what Chris is talking about, the reason why you have international programs. And it is about these experiences. So bringing international students to our campuses, not for the money. That's a wonderful second byproduct that people love to have money. But it's to change the discourse in the classroom.
Yes.
And to give that student, you know, the institutions I serve at, we have a lot of first generation students. They never get out of San Bernardino, Bakersfield. They just don't get out of those communities. And so it's a way for them to have an international experience, to be sitting next to a Chinese student in a classroom.
If a conversation develops.
If it,
Well,
yes.
and that seems to be the problem, or the challenge, because a lot of times there's, you know, we're seeing the same kind of trend that a large portion of them are Chinese and South Korea and India as well, and they end up, because, you know, they're comfortable with their own language, they only come to class and that's the only time that they are speaking English. And so what we're finding, particularly with the undergraduates, is that you know, they're failing their classes, but unlike some of the first generation students, we're actually retaining those students. So they take the class over and over and over again, and that seems really unfair to those students who are now having to pay for these classes multiple times. So I think that we want to create an environment where it really is an international environment, as opposed to, you know, the Chinese culture and the South Korean culture and keeping them separate. So I think one of our challenges is really to, you know, just like we're thinking about it interdisciplinary, thinking of it as internationally, and spending some time not just getting to know, having them get to know the American culture, but, you know, getting to know, you know, celebrating Chinese New Year and contributing and learning more about their cultures that they're bringing to the table, because I think that's the kind of conversations we want to have.
Well, we have an Asian Studies program when I was at San Bernardino, and that's exactly the sort of things we did. So we had domestic students who were in this Asian Studies program, and we had Chinese, Korean, Saudi, all international students come in, and they were partnered one-on-one with them. They had to do assignments with them, so that there was that sort of integration. Having an international night that celebrates all the different sort of traditions, those sorts of things are ways that you can get that. Another is through study abroad. We took trips, we had business faculty who took students on a study abroad, short-term study abroad to Qatar. And the largest percentage of students on that trip were actually the Chinese students. It was a way for them to get there. Michael Cahote is a geographer at San Bernardino, Cal State San Bernardino. He did a study abroad that students could take 2 of 3 courses. Either his geography of Costa Rica, there was a poetry faculty who went. They could take a poetry class that was based in Latin America, or they could take Spanish. So they had 3 faculty that went. So they teamed up to do a study abroad to give those students that sort of opportunity. So I think we have to think about student exchanges, but also faculty exchanges, and how you can internationalize your curriculum. We had a Chinese business faculty who did a study abroad to China. He had another international business faculty member who had never been to China. And so he came along as a faculty sort of in residence on the study abroad. That gave him some China examples in his classroom. So you have to find ways to have faculty exchanges, bring them to us to them, have the student exchanges, the same thing, just try and you can internationalize a curriculum in those sorts of ways too.
So that's a great place to stop this conversation, because it's a high note. It's talking about one of the true strengths of geography, and that is to create this kind of sense of global citizenship. So I'd like you to thank our distinguished panelists.